Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Friday, September 24th, 2021, Orlando, Florida. The student housing corridor at Arden Villas is quiet in the late afternoon. Phones start missing their marks, texts unanswered, calls rolling to voicemail. What breaks the calm isn't a shout or a crash, it's a line of numbers in an access control report. The apartment door assigned to 19-year-old Miya shows two deadbolt openings by an on-call master key earlier that day. Later, at 5:06 p.m., the system records Miya using her own fob to enter. In investigations like this, access is the first battlefield. Whoever can open a door before a resident returns has time, privacy, and advantage. We work from facts, not rumor. Student complexes use tiered credentials, resident badges, staff badges, and on-call or master credentials. Every use is time-stamped. The logs here are not vague. They establish an opportunity window inside a controlled environment where forced entry isn't required. There's no need to guess about broken latches or pried frames. The deadbolt complied because an authorized credential told it to. That's not a hunch. That's a record. From a procedural standpoint, 3 lanes exist and only 3. First, a voluntary departure coincident with maintenance activity. Possible but inconsistent with a pre-planned evening itinerary and sudden communication cutoff. Second, an outsider defeating building controls. Unlikely without forced entry indicators or piggybacking evidence. Third, an insider misuse of authorized access. Unproven at this moment but consistent with the log pattern. The job now is to collapse the wrong lanes using physical surveillance, gate data, key issuance logs, staff schedules, and phone metadata. Clean sequences can be deceptive. When the data aligns too neatly, someone often planned it that way. The context matters, but only the kind that narrows the field. Miya is a Valencia College student who lives and works on the property. A resident with predictable hours in a building with auditable keys is not an easy target for a stranger in the wind. If something went wrong, it likely started with the privilege to enter. That's why the first evidence bucket in this case is infrastructure. Who was on call, who signed out what devices were used at which doors, and how those timestamps line up with cameras, gate arms, and vehicle movement. There is no speculation here about what happened inside the apartment after 5:06 p.m. The record doesn't need color, it needs correlation. Hallway cameras and exterior approaches establish presence and timing even when angles are imperfect. Gate logs verify entries and exits. Phone records can show device movement or abrupt silence. Each source is limited alone. Together, they draw a perimeter around the truth. This is a homicide case that will eventually change Florida law, but it begins with a small anomaly, a door that opened for someone it shouldn't have. In towns big or small, that's how murders register at first, not in screams, but in systems. The work now is simple to state and hard to do. Protect the chain of custody, lock the timeline, and follow the credentials wherever they lead. Miya is not a mystery to the people who love her, and she isn't a cipher to investigators either. She is a 19-year-old Valencia College student who lives and works at Arden Villas. What matters here is not a long life story, but observable routines that can be tested against records. When investigators tighten a case, they start with what a victim was scheduled to do and what the systems say actually happened. The evening of Friday, September 24, 2021, Miya had a plan. Family and friends expected movement and communication from her that night, including travel arrangements. Airlines keep definitive logs, bookings, boarding scans, changes, no-shows. Buses and ride-shares leave their own trails, pickup requests, cancellations, routes. None of those channels show a completed trip. Nothing indicates she left Orlando by a legitimate carrier after the late afternoon. That discrepancy matters. People who intend to travel usually generate a chain of digital noise, confirmations, bank pings, location updates. Here, the noise cuts off. Phones aren't just contact tools, they are timekeeping devices with patterns. Investigators pull message cadence, power cycles, and any cloud backup activity authorized by legal process. Miya's communication arc is steady in the hours before late afternoon and then stalls. No outgoing calls answer. Texts from family and friends sit without response. If a device moves later, it leaves a map. If it goes dark, that's its own signal. Either way, the abrupt change aligns with a narrow window already defined by building systems. In a campus-adjacent property where most nights look the same, A sudden absence of routine stands out. Workplaces are data sources in cases like this. Leasing offices and student housing employers track shift times, task lists, and key pickups. Colleagues know who closes, who is on call, who is around after 5 p.m. Those records confirm that Mia's day was ordinary until it wasn't. There is no documented conflict at the office, no disciplinary note, and no sign she intended to resign, vacate, or start over someplace else. For investigators, this is the difference between a person voluntarily stepping away from commitments and a person interrupted mid-pattern. Mia's commitments were active. Home environments add context without guesswork. Friends expect replies, families expect check-ins, and neighbors notice doors, lights, and music. The unit itself sits behind controlled access, doors that only open for residents and authorized staff. When you put those facts next to the night silence from Mia's phone and the absence of legitimate travel movement, the case moves off the walked-away lane quickly. It isn't a narrative choice, it's the weight of the available records. There is also the question of risk profile. Students who live and work in the same complex have predictable paths: leasing office, unit, parking, common areas. Predictability is a protective factor when access is policed and logged. It becomes a vulnerability when someone with knowledge or privilege decides to misuse it. That's why victimology here focuses on setting, not psychology. The setting is the lever. Families often say a victim would never disappear. Investigators don't lean on that alone. They look for objective corroboration. Here, corroboration exists: a planned evening activity that never registers, transportation that never scans, and a phone that stops behaving like its user. The combination narrows motive to opportunity tied to access. It does not accuse a person. It accuses a method. In towns all over America, murders don't always announce themselves with broken windows or alarms. They appear first as missed confirmations in schedules that stop mid-sentence. That's where Mia's case sits at the end of this phase. A young woman with active plans, an anchored routine, and a sudden data void that begins inside a controlled property. The human point is simple and practical. In multi-unit housing, the most important safety question isn't, do I lock my door? It's, who else can open it, and how is that use recorded? In apartment investigations, doors testify, not with statements, but with logs. Arden Villas uses electronic deadbolts linked to role-based credentials, resident badges with limited scope, staff badges tied to job function, and an on-call master key that can open units across the property. Each credential leaves a record: date, time, door, and the specific fob or card used. That architecture matters because it converts a private space into an auditable scene. When a resident vanishes and there's no forced entry, the master key pipeline becomes the first place to look. Here's how the pipeline is supposed to work. Management maintains an on-call roster. The master credential is checked out under a name, a shift, and a reason, with a log of any keys physically removed from a lockbox or any digital fob activated for the shift. Requests for entry are documented: work orders, tenant authorizations, emergency notes. If an entry is legitimate, the paper matches the pixels. A work order aligns with a door event, a staff presence appears on cameras, and the time window makes sense. If the entry is not legitimate, gaps appear. A door opens but there's no work order. A name is on call, but the person is off camera in the corridor where they claim to be. A maintenance call is placed after the fact to create cover. That kind of misalignment is what investigators test for in the hours after a disappearance. The building's cameras are not cinematic, but they are useful. Hallway and gate angles do three things well: place a badge holder in a zone, confirm direction of travel, and anchor the time base against independent systems, like cell tower hits or license plate readers. Investigators sync the access logs to camera motion blocks, then overlay the on-call schedule to see who could physically reach a target door during the relevant window. One method is to start at the moment the resident last badged and work backward through the day for any privileged entries at that door. Another is to map the on-call credentials use across the entire complex to see whether the pattern looks like routine maintenance or a beeline toward a single unit. Routine work leaves a scatter. Targeted misuse leaves a cluster. Master key abuse investigations also audit telephony. When a building receives a maintenance request, the call center records the inbound number, timestamp, and reason. If a caller reports a leak or a malfunction to justify entry, The claim can be tested. Was the tenant home? Did any sensor alert to a leak? Does any neighbor recall noise or water? If a call comes from a number linked to staff, not a resident, reported for a time after a suspicious entry, it does not prove intent, but it adds weight to a misuse theory. In this case, the existence of a maintenance pretext call following earlier master key activity becomes a point of interest that investigators will match against staff movements and access rights. Access systems generate device IDs that are as distinctive as fingerprints. Two employees can hold the same job title and even share a shift, but their fobs are unique. When a door event is exported, it shows which device negotiated the unlock. That means I didn't open that door is not a persuasive statement if the log shows a specific fob doing exactly that at a precise moment. Chain of custody then shifts from the door to the credential. Who possessed the fob, whether it was properly checked out, whether anyone else could have used it, whether surveillance shows an exchange. If a fob holder appears on camera near the unit before the resident returns, and there's no corresponding work order, the pattern is not ambiguous. It's also standard to audit the key control room itself. Investigators review CCTV covering the lockbox, verify that checkout entries were handwritten or digital in real time, not added later, and interview staff about handoffs at shift change. Small details matter: a signature missing a contact number, a time rounded to the nearest hour rather than to the minute, a work order code that doesn't match the maintenance software's format. Legitimate operations are boringly consistent. Deception is noisy. The human side of this is not ignored. Residents rely on master key systems for emergencies. They also assume those systems are policed. In the wake of this case, Florida will change how apartments screen employees and manage key access. But at this point in the timeline, before any policy shifts, investigators are confined to the structure they have. The assignment is clear. Identify which authorized credential opened Mia's door before she returned, determine whether that entry was justified, and map the credential holder's movements through the property and beyond. Early name-dropping can warp an investigation. The better route is to let the infrastructure lead. When you line up the door events with staffing and cameras, the field of candidates narrows without speculation. If a single fob appears at the right door, near the right time, and then shows up at a vehicle captured leaving the property, the case begins to acquire shape. That is how an apartment turns from backdrop into evidence. Two brief reflections to close. First, in multi-unit housing, safety lives in the boring details. Check-in logs, access audits, notice policies. Second, accountability is possible because buildings now create their own records of who entered and when. If you're watching this from a rental or dorm, consider a practical question. Do you know how your property logs master key use? And would you be allowed to see those entries after a serious incident? When a door opens at the wrong time, policy meets people. Investigators pulled the on-call maintenance roster for that Friday and laid it next to the access control exports. The roster spelled out who covered which block of hours, where the master credential should have been, and how handoffs were supposed to occur. Sign-out sheets and lockbox footage were then used to verify whether those rules were followed minute by minute. Clean operations leave clean paperwork. What appeared on the property logs was not uniformly clean. Work orders came next. Each legitimate entry into a unit should be anchored to a dated request with a reason that makes sense: leak, lock issue, appliance failure, plus a time that lines up with the door event. Several entries around the time frame read as generic placeholders. Some were created after the access events had already occurred. That doesn't prove intent, but it creates the kind of misalignment that pushes investigators away from rumor and toward custody. Who held the credential when those doors opened? Camera coverage wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Gate lenses caught vehicles arriving and leaving. The leasing office angle watched the path to the lockbox. Corridor cameras framed approach and dwell time near specific doors. Detectives synchronized all three with the access system's timestamps. The task was narrow: identify any on-call credential that could physically reach the victim's hallway during the defined window and determine whether any presence there was supported by a corresponding work order. The mapping exercise reduced a building full of possibilities to a short list of credential holders whose movements intersected the victim's floor when no documented maintenance was due. Phone records added another layer. Properties receive maintenance calls from residents and staff. The software logs the caller ID and the time. Late that day, a maintenance pretext call referenced a vague issue. There were no corroborating sensor alerts or neighbor reports tied to the unit. The timing mattered. It created the appearance of a reason after the system had already recorded earlier master credential activity at the door. That sequence isn't an accusation. It's a flag that moves the inquiry toward who had the fob instead of what was wrong with the apartment. Unique device IDs did the heavy lifting. Each master fob negotiates a door unlock using its own identifier. The exported events showed exactly which device opened the unit ahead of the resident's return. From there, the question wasn't whether the door opened, the log had answered that. It was who possessed that device at that moment. Chain of custody had to be airtight. Sign-outs, shift schedules, any mid-shift handoffs, and whether surveillance caught an informal pass between co-workers. Teams audited the lockbox footage for the entire afternoon into evening, looking for small tells, a credential left unattended, a handoff outside the documented rotation, or a pickup that didn't match the times on the roster. Interviews served to test memories against records. Staff were asked to account for their exact tasks, where they were between specific timestamps, and why any entry occurred without a matching request. Investigators weren't fishing for confessions, they were measuring consistency. Ordinary operations produce consistent answers: task, location, duration, and proof. Inconsistent answers don't automatically imply wrongdoing, but in a controlled access investigation, they shrink the field to those who both could and plausibly did. Neighbors and tenants filled in what cameras couldn't. A person loitering near a door where no work order existed, tools carried at an odd hour, a familiar shirt or hat that appears on corridor footage. Individually, these are soft signals. Together, they either support the roster plus logs picture or they don't. In this case, the picture that emerged showed a credential assigned to a specific role appearing along the path to the unit when there was no documented need to be there. That role will eventually have a name attached to it, but discipline matters. You follow the credential to the person, not the other way around. There's a straightforward tenant safety point tucked inside all of this. Residents trust that emergency access is rare, logged, and justified. Notices before non-emergency entries are not courtesy, they're control. Audit trails should exist not only for management but also for residents disputing unexplained entries. Many properties promise that transparency, fewer deliver it without delay. Cases like this one are exactly why those logs must be structured, preserved, and available when requested in good faith. By early evening on the day after the disappearance, detectives had a working hypothesis grounded in records, not rumor. A single credential could be traced from lockbox to hallway to exit, with paperwork lagging behind the digital footprint. The name attached to that credential is deliberately withheld here until the midpoint reveal, but the method is no longer abstract. The route through the building is defined, and the next phase moves beyond the property line to see whether that credential holder's movements continue to align with cameras, gate exits, and device activity offsite. One question for those watching from similar communities: if your building had to reconstruct master key use right now, would the on-call roster, lockbox footage, and door logs tell the same story down to the minute? Once the credential trail pointed down the 6th floor corridor, the work moved outside. Investigators exported gate data and cross-matched it with plate captures on nearby arterials. The aim wasn't to reconstruct the entire city, only to flag vehicles tied to on-call personnel during the critical late afternoon window and chart where those vehicles went next. Gate arms provided precise timestamps. Exterior cameras confirmed which lane was used and whether a vehicle paused, idled, or left directly. That produced a short list of departures worth following beyond the property line. Route analysis began at immediate choke points, the complex exit, the nearest intersections with fixed traffic cameras, and any commercial lots known to keep their own video. Detectives requested video in tight time blocks to avoid drowning in footage. They looked for consistent markers, distinctive wheels, a window sticker, a partial plate, then walked the sequence forward intersection by intersection. Where the city didn't have cameras, they leaned on businesses, convenience stores, storage facilities, apartment garages. The process was tedious, but it pushed a credible vehicle west and south, away from campus flow, and toward pockets of wooded land and older complexes along the lake corridors. Digital forensics opened a parallel lane. Warrants returned historical cell site information for devices associated with on-call personnel and for Miya's phone. The victim's device activity dropped abruptly, consistent with our earlier profile, but network records still painted a canvas of which sectors lit up near the departures in question. Investigators weren't looking for a perfect path. They wanted overlaps. If the same vehicle captured on video also appeared in sector coverage consistent with the direction of travel, the confidence in that route increased. If the route repeatedly skirted greenbelts, retention ponds, or unlit parcels with vehicle access, search planners took note. Search operations stood up quickly. Teams divided the map into primary and secondary zones. Primary, where video and sector data overlapped with plausible pull-offs. Secondary, where only one data type suggested interest. They prioritized parcels that matched a practical offender profile: vehicle access without passers-by, concealment from the road, and enough cover to work without drawing notice. Deputies and volunteers were briefed to log exact GPS for every find: shoe, plastic, tape, clothing, so analysts could plot clusters. Nothing significant turns up in the first sweeps, but the pattern of where the vehicle lingers begins to matter. Pauses at certain curb cuts repeat across different days. Those pauses earn more resources. Back at the property, detectives overlaid the outbound path with inbound returns. Any suspect route would likely include a staging area, a disposal site, and a way back that minimized exposure. Fuel purchases and ATM camera pulls along the corridor were checked for matches. A particular commercial lot recorded a vehicle consistent with the one of interest parked for several minutes before re-entering traffic. No purchase was logged at the attached store. The stop appears purposeless on paper. Stops without transactions often mean an offender is reorganizing, checking surroundings, verifying tools, or watching access points. Aerial assets were limited, but a helicopter pass helped identify disturbed ground patterns near drainage easements, areas easy to reach and easier to forget. Ground teams confirmed that most were animal trails or old utility cuts. Still, the map was getting smaller. When cases move, they rarely do it in a straight line. They move because enough narrow facts overlap in one direction. In this investigation, video, sector hits, and the logic of concealment were all leaning west of the property into older residential pockets and fragmented woods. That lean would become important soon. Interviews continued in parallel. Detectives revisited staff who were on duty, asking for exact end-of-shift routes, family obligations, and fuel stops. The point wasn't to catch anyone in a lie for its own sake. It was to document paths that could be measured against cameras and sector coverage. One account placed a worker's evening well east of the property. The video said otherwise. Another account explained a late evening detour as a personal errand. Transaction logs did not support it. Each inconsistency by itself was explainable. In aggregate, they tightened the circle around a single pattern that matched the maps on the wall. Search commanders briefed the family with caution. They did not broadcast coordinates or promise timelines, but they made clear that resources were now aimed at specific parcels. Community volunteers asked what would help most. The answer was simple: report anything that seems out of place. Fresh tire ruts where none are expected, taped plastic, clothing, or recently disturbed brush lines. Leads from civilians receive mixed reputations in big cases, but they matter when a search grid grows, and especially when the public trusts the process enough to participate. There's a human cost in these days that doesn't appear in reports. Families are asked to stand by while strangers parse images and pings. Viewers sometimes ask why investigators don't just go everywhere. In reality, effective searches require discipline. The team owes the victim a map built on evidence, not guesswork. That's why the presence of repeat pauses along one corridor and the alignment of those pauses with concealment-friendly parcels was the break they needed. It didn't hand them an answer. It gave them a direction competent teams can work. Before this phase closes, one practical note for anyone living in a city like Orlando. If your community keeps cameras at gates or lots, understand how long they retain footage and how quickly they respond to lawful requests. Cooperation windows close fast. In cases like this, early preservation letters from detectives made the difference between footage saved and footage overwritten. The search grid will soon narrow to a set of parcels that look unremarkable from the road, but carry all the features investigators prioritize: access, cover, and time. That's where the story goes next, not because it is dramatic, but because the routes and records say it should. By the second full day of work, the credential picture was clear enough to put a name on the board. Armando Manuel Caballero, 27, maintenance employee at Arden Villas. He had access authority during the period under review and prior contact with 19-year-old Miya that co-workers described as unwanted. The designation wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. With a narrowing roster, you identify the person tied to the credential, lock down their movements, and preserve every source of evidence linked to them. Detectives executed the basic playbook. They secured Caballero's personnel file, shift assignments, and any disciplinary notes. They pulled the key control records to confirm custody of the on-call device and reviewed lockbox video for handoffs. They checked vehicle registration, insurance, and plate history to line up what the gate cameras had already captured. Search warrants began to return on phones linked to him, with carrier data providing course location hits for the window that mattered. None of this required speculation. It required signatures, exports, and chain of custody discipline. The contact history mattered because it partially explained opportunity. Coworkers described unsolicited attention toward Miya in the months before she disappeared. A separate local report from earlier that year, at another complex, documented a boundary-violating incident unrelated to Miya. Investigators noted it for pattern context, not as proof of guilt here. The point was not to build a personality profile. The point was to understand whether prior behavior increased access attempts or escalated interest in a resident who had made her boundaries clear. On the evening of September 27, 2021, before the case reached the point of arrest, Caballero was found deceased in Seminole County in what authorities described as an apparent suicide. That development immediately changed the job. It removed the prospect of a custodial interview, any Mirandized statement, or a courtroom cross-examination. It did not end the case. It reoriented it. Without a living suspect, the file itself would have to carry the weight of proof. Every log, camera angle, device record, and physical recovery stitched together into a conclusion strong enough to withstand public scrutiny and later, a policy debate. Investigators moved fast to protect what could still be lost. They impounded his vehicle to document trace evidence, receipts, and route clues. They secured his living space and digital accounts for devices, notes, and deletion artifacts. They canvassed businesses along the suspected corridor for any purchase that could tie him to materials used in restraint or transport, knowing that simply buying a common item proves nothing but timing plus location sometimes matters. They re-interviewed staff and neighbors with narrower questions: where he was during specific minutes, whether anyone saw him near the leasing office outside his assigned tasks, whether there were informal fob passes not captured on forms. The family needed answers, but the case needed structure. With no trial ahead, the standard became, could this file have supported charges if the suspect were alive? That's where the discipline of the first 5 segments paid off. The credential history had already been pinned down. The route analysis was underway. The next steps were to connect those systems to off-property decisions that led search teams to specific parcels. In homicide work, you don't get points for drama, you get points for sequencing. Establish access, establish movement, establish result. A word about tone here. People sometimes believe a death like this draws a line under the file. It doesn't. It can obscure facts, but it can't erase them. For Miya's family, and for the community that lives behind master key doors, the burden is to show the sequence in plain terms. That's how public trust is kept, by letting the records speak and refusing to guess where they don't. Before we move to the fieldwork that follows this name, a practical question for anyone watching from a similar property. If an employee under scrutiny died mid-investigation, would your building's control systems still be able to answer who held the master credential, where it went, and when it was used? Good systems make accountability possible, even when testimony is no longer available. The record closes the gap without theater. A master credential opens Miya Marcano's deadbolt before she returns on Friday, September 24, 2021. Her evening plan doesn't happen. No boarding scan, no confirmed ride, phone activity tapering instead of moving. Custody of that credential resolves to a single maintenance employee on coverage. The paperwork lags the access it tries to justify. Cameras put him within reach of her hallway and then in a vehicle leaving the property. Route work carries that vehicle west into older parcels where brief pauses repeat along the same corridor. The grid built from those pauses leads to Tymber Skan. On October 2, 2021, searchers recover Miya in a wooded tract there. Forensics document duct tape and bindings, wrists behind her back, ankles secured. The medical examiner establishes manner, homicide, cause, undetermined because of condition at discovery. That phrasing is not hedging. It reflects science. Restraint and circumstances prove criminal agency even when a single mechanism cannot be named. 3 days after the disappearance, the person tied to the credential, Armando Manuel Caballero, is found deceased by apparent suicide in Seminole County. With no interview or trial possible, the sheriff's office measures the file against the standard a prosecutor would use: access, custody, proximity, movement, recovery. The answer is sufficient. The case is closed by exception, attributing Miya's killing to Caballero based on the totality of evidence. What follows is not a twist, but a correction. In June 2022, Florida enacts Miya's Law, SB 898, effective July 1, 2022. It requires robust background screening for apartment staff, 24-hour notice for non-emergency entry, and key control logs that survive scrutiny. These changes do not rewrite what happened. They try to keep a door from opening for the wrong reasons again. There is a human line that runs beneath every report page, a family that kept calling when the system went quiet, classmates who waited for a message that never came. Justice here is not a verdict, it's clarity. The file speaks plainly: how a privilege was misused, how a route was chosen, how a community looked until they found her. If you live behind an electronic lock, ask the simple questions that matter. Who can enter? How is it logged? How long is it kept? And can you see it when it counts? Safety isn't a slogan. It's paperwork done right before anyone needs it. Miya deserved ordinary things: a weekend, a routine, a life measured in small plans. We honor her by insisting the systems around us are worthy of trust, and by refusing to let this read like two stories when it has always been one. I'm leaving you with this: safety isn't paranoia, it's preparation. Ask who can enter your home, how entries are logged, and how long records are kept. Teach your kids to trust their instincts and tell someone when a boundary is crossed. Communities stay safe when we notice patterns and speak up early. What would you change in your building tomorrow? What rights should every renter know by heart? If this story moved you, drop a comment. Tell me your thoughts or where you're watching from. If it didn't, say why. And if you want more true cases told straight, please subscribe to the channel.